Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Non-People Identities, the New Battleground in Cloud Security, sponsored by Sonri Security. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Sandy Bird, co-founder and CTO of Sonri Security, and Serge Borso, SANS Associate Instructor. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters. Oh, and Sandy, I'm realizing we need to have you share your screen again.
Will do, Carol.
Okay, looks good.
Thanks, Carol, for turning it over, and welcome, Serge, joining me today. Again, everyone, we're going to go through some kind of great examples of the new identity in cloud and how a lot of this works. Serge, I understand your background is pen testing, lots of pen testing. You do a lot of work in cloud when you do pen testing these days?
More and more over the last 8, 7, 6, 5. Every single year it seems to increase more with the client base that we have. So without a doubt, we're seeing a lot of our clients are either had some on-prem and now they're shifting to cloud, or they're just 100%. A lot of them are just 100% in the cloud from day one, and that's just where they're at. So without a doubt. Yeah,
no, it's interesting. We again, even our own products, as we do pen testing and things like that, it's interesting to find pen testers that are very familiar with cloud, because the vectors are sometimes a little different and a little more crafty as you do some of these things. So it's always fun to talk about this stuff as we go through this. So Serge and I are going to lead everyone through here. Again, Serge, welcome for joining me. I think, I'm sure you're 20 years in security. I'm 20 years in security as well. And, we'll have lots of different things to talk about as we go through here. Today we're going to kind of focus on 4 things. And, one of them clearly is around this kind of, non-people identities, right? Because as you build more automation into everything that you do, you have a lot of systems doing things on your behalf. And we need to understand how that works and what risks that may present. And then, of course, what would this be without some best practices on the SANS front of what we need to do about all these things as they're here. And then, we'll take some quick looks into what some of this stuff looks like. So we'll show some examples of some of these non-people identities and the rights they get and things like that. Any thoughts on your side, Serge?
Yeah, it's interesting. As time has progressed, there was a shift to thinking about what a boundary looks like, and from a cloud perspective, that boundary is shifting. And more recently, it's been more of IAM, identity and access management, being that new frontier and the new boundary of here's where we got to focus our efforts. And I'm seeing a lot more identity-focused material coming out, a lot more identity-focused technology and solutions and security offerings and companies. And it's just there's a huge focus on identity and figuring out what really constitutes an identity today, so we can lock down the environment from that perspective, because there's just so many facets to who has access to what's operating inside of our environment, and what happens when we're not paying close attention to these actions. So it's very, very interesting topic. I think it's very timely as well.
Yeah, there's always 2 parts I always think about as we move into this kind of new world. We hate to admit it, but in the old enterprise world, we used defense in depth, and what that usually meant was multiple levels of boundary firewalls stacked on top of one another. I remember when I worked for a very large company, our development lab was, I think, 3 or 4 boundary firewalls from the internet. So it didn't matter what a developer did, they kind of could never expose anything anyway, because it was so buried inside the organization. And as we've moved over to cloud, we do defense in depth, but it's no longer based on multiple levels of networking. It's, networking is only one lever, identity is another lever. And I actually believe, when we get into the data side, policies on keys and stuff kind of become another level. So you still have defense in depth, but you just apply it in a different way, certainly as you're doing this stuff in cloud. So it's shifting, certainly. The other thing that's really neat about the cloud vendors are they've almost all taken identity as the primary form of control. If you look at, what Amazon does, adding on to their identity models, it makes it more complex. Don't get me wrong, it's probably one of the most complex identity models that's ever been created, but they use that identity model, to basically build unbelievably strong controls in Amazon. And if you use it right, you can do amazing things. If you get it wrong, obviously it's catastrophic, but it really does have the levers in it to do amazing things in identity. So certainly on that side, good.
Yeah,
Well, look,
that's a good point. Even in there's a Sec 488 course from SANS, and that's the whole first day is just IAM. We're talking about securing your cloud accounts and securing Amazon and GCP and Azure, and it's like the number one focus is IAM. You have to be able to lock that component down because that's the like I mentioned a moment ago, it's kind of the gateway into your whole environment. And if you're not paying close attention to who has access to what and what different services are running and what different pieces of technology that you're utilizing, it becomes very difficult to be able to implement any type of defense in-depth strategy because you just don't know what's going on inside your environment. And once again, it presents interesting opportunities of where we can focus our efforts to try to come up with some solutions for it.
Yeah, certainly. No, I think that there's some really neat stuff on the solution side. And then again, this is where I think some people fall down a little bit in Amazon, and it's great that SANS is offering some great courses in this because of the complexity of the identity models, you do actually have to understand how they work, because stuff that seems so obvious in what you're looking at may not be as obvious as you think. If you take away the rights for somebody to, read an object out of S3, but then there's a resource policy that can override that, you have to understand that order of operations or you could get it wrong, right? And I think that's a great thing for SANS to be doing, because it's something that, most people don't understand. There's about 11 rules, I think, in Amazon on how you get or do not get permissions on that. Look, let's talk about kind of the different types of these non-people identities. We're pretty familiar with users, and doing single sign-on and things like that, but in most of the clouds, you have this concept for any piece of, running compute. You have the ability to give it an identity almost directly. And it's actually done in a really interesting way in the cloud providers, where under the covers, it actually kind of starts to use short-lived credentials and stuff. So you don't have these long-term access keys. It's really, really nice. But it does mean that, all of those kind of compute processes running within that piece of compute, whether it's a serverless function or a virtual machine or, something else, has all of the rights of that identity, and however you configure it, it gets those. So those all become identities in the modern world. Basically every piece of compute you have running, whatever type it is, doesn't matter if it's serverless or a container or VM, has a set of rights. You have this kind of concept of, these service accounts, and sometimes they're run by people, but sometimes they're run by, other processes as well. And so those are kind of non-people identities that have to be governed as well, because again, if they're there and they're accessible by something, then they can be breached and used for nefarious purposes. You got all your automation stuff going on. Unfortunately, Serge, and I'm sure your pen testing crew loves this stuff, but almost every customer we go into, the build roles are all deployed with star permissions. Of course, every developer says, of course it is. I don't know what I'm going to deploy next month. But the problem is because it has star permissions, it can also terminate the account, which probably isn't the desired outcome. So, we have all of these bots and automation roles running around, often highly overprivileged. But, again, I work with developers too. I understand what they're trying to do every day. We just have to give them better tools to help them. And then clearly the cloud services have permissions too. And we start to talk about privilege escalation. I'm sure you got pen testers do this a lot, Serge, where they use the cloud services permissions, where if they have permission to manipulate it, they can get it to do something on their behalf that sometimes opens up another piece of intelligence that they can use for, lateral movement and things. So these are kind of the concepts when we talk about, non-people identities and, them having rights as well, or permissions as well. Any thoughts on anything else there, Serge, or how you use some of this stuff in lateral movement when you're doing pen testing would be interesting.
Absolutely. So you mentioned developers, it's admins, it's your sales folks, it's anybody who's within your environment, and you mentioned it very clearly. All these different compute processes all have their own identities, they all have their own permissions, they all have their own ways they're configured, and more often than not, I've seen exactly what you just said. You have the star permission. It's like the thing here is that folks are trying to get the job done. They need the technology to work. They need the production go live date to be hit, and they're going to configure it in a way that works. And you know what works? Having permissions for everything to get the job done. And that is great from the perspective of, yeah, sure, it's going to work, but it's terrible from the perspective of, we got to lock this down. So I'm looking at this from a pen test perspective. I'm going to 169.254.169.254, check out the metadata. It's like, okay, what permissions do I have? And right off the bat, you see, okay, yes, your environment is operating and it's working, and your product is live. But oh my gosh, there's holes all over the place, simply because it's so wide open. And a lot of that's going to come down to thinking through the process of rolling out your solutions in a way that you're not being overly permissive, and understanding your various components from an IAM perspective. It's very, very interesting.
No, it certainly is. It's kind of interesting to walk through how some of this stuff comes to be in cloud too. I love this little diagram because it kind of it talks about this kind of movement and how these things happen. So, you always have this concept. You called it an admin. So you have an admin that has access to a resource, and that's a pretty common pattern we've seen for years. This particular admin can log into this database or whatever it happens to be. And then you have these clouds that have added these concepts where now we have, roles in AWS, which can be assumed by compute and services and all kinds of things. You have service principals in Azure. Under the covers of Azure, those service principals sometimes are called MSIs, and there's a bunch of different kind of interesting apps, but they all kind of roll back to this kind of service principal concept in Azure. You have access keys, service accounts in GCP, but so you have all of these interesting things, and they have access to these resources as well. And as Serge was saying, calling the metadata services, if you can get that temporary permission for that role that piece of compute's using, then you can use it to basically access one of those data stores. We love to see people using, secret stores and key vaults, things like HashiCorp Vault. That's been something that's been across a lot of our customers. It has some really interesting policies in it that allow you to control how something, it could be a piece of computer or a human that gets access to a secret, then gets access to a key, which gives access to these data stores. And that path is one that's quite interesting. You of course have all those VMs and containers that then have access to all of this. What's interesting about this is it's kind of a reciprocal loop where, you now have a piece of a serverless function, a VM, whichever, which has access to a role, which then may have access to another VM, right? So again, for lateral movement, you can jump and chain these things together many times. You have single sign-on. Again, hopefully you guys are all out there doing great, people single sign-on stuff with strong MFA and risk-based profiling and things. And then of course you have, the cloud services themselves. So you put this whole model together and you want to ask yourself a simple question. You've got a bunch of PII data or loan applications or whatever it happens to be sitting in a sensitive data store, and you just want to know, show me everything that can get access to this given data store, and it becomes a very hard question to calculate. The cloud providers, of course, dropped on top of that all of these enhancements in their identity models to do governance. So they basically will say, from a global level within this zone, maybe it's an account, maybe it's a subscription in Azure or project in GCP, never allow anyone to create an internet gateway, or never allow anyone to create a new identity, or whatever it happens to be. And by blocking that, even though your admin may have a star permission, or the serverless container may have a star permission, some of those permissions have been taken away. And so trying to understand, again, is there a violation here by giving someone star? You really have to understand the entire model to figure out what's going on. And I'm sure it's frustrating when you do pen testing in these large environments that have strong SCPs, but they didn't give you didn't get to the SCP account, so you can't see what they are. And you're trying these things that it looks like you have permissions to, but they're failing, right? And it is a complex model, but you have to put it all together to truly understand it. And it's really interesting. Every cloud vendor is a little different in how they do it, and there's pros and cons to them all. Again, I think if I go the most complex road, it's Amazon's. The least complex road is GCP's. But then, GCP has interesting things where the permissions and the actions aren't always the same name. So it's really hard to try to build least privileged roles in GCP if you don't have the mapping. So again, interesting world that we live in. And of course, this opens up some stuff to breaches. I don't know, Serge, if you've looked into any of these breaches or how they happen or things like that, but it is an interesting world. We're still seeing tons of S3 misconfigured, which isn't really a non-people identity problem. But we're starting to see more and more scenarios where it's an access key, or it's, as you say, vulnerability on the VM, call the metadata service, use that key to get access to the next jump. What have you seen in this space? What do your pen testers, see as common patterns and things like that?
That's interesting that you asked that, because, and interesting that you highlighted these aren't necessarily non-people identity risks specifically, but I would throw in probably what you're thinking, and maybe what a lot of the audience is thinking as well, in that at the end of the day, it almost always becomes an issue of IAM and largely non-people identities, because if you do have a misconfigured blob storage or S3 bucket, or you could have some even credentials in a GitHub account that are used against you, right? You're not extracting those or pulling them out before you upload your code, and those get exposed. And when these type of things happen, at the end of the day, there still is some permission associated with a role, associated with an identity, and now it's becoming more of a monitoring perspective conversation, I should say, where what just happened? Are we seeing what just happened? And are we noticing that it's abnormal? And then really what I thought about a moment ago with that last slide really was mapping. The word that came to me was mapping. Back in the day, it would be Microsoft Active Directory environment, and you're using something like Bloodhound. You're mapping out, what does this user have access to? How can you laterally move to escalate privilege across this AD environment? Same thing now from an identity perspective in the cloud. What does this user or role or non-identity have access to? What permissions, and how could you laterally move or escalate that to gain access to something else? And then, leverage keys, whether those are short or long-term keys, and elevate permissions. So from this perspective here, we're looking at these different breaches and things that are in the news. They come up all the time. And it's just important to realize that while we can restrict access to the best of our ability, we still need to have controls in place to understand the mapping between various components in our environment. And then, of course, the monitoring and alerting piece is always huge in my perspective. And I think a lot of other security professionals as well, just having some grip over what's happening. So you can answer the question of, is this baseline normal, or is this weird, and should we be able to see this and do something about it?
It's again, there's so many great things to talk about what you just said. It's this is one of the common things that we see in cloud environments, as like all of these services, Amazon has hundreds of services, Azure has hundreds of services. And, the way that you configure even the monitoring, the logging of that service is often unique per service. And then some functions aren't even logged. And there's often additional levers you have to pull to turn on the enhanced logging in all of the clouds. And it makes sense. Obviously, if it's a sandbox account with nothing sensitive in it, you don't need enhanced logging. But if it's your production data, then you do, right? And one of the things that we've kind of gotten to start working with our customers on is that, they'll come into this very large cloud environment. Of course, they scan it. They find out they don't have enhanced logging turned on across, huge parts of their cloud. And they'll say, man, we don't know where to even start, right? We have to go back to every development team and tell them they've got to do this differently. And one of the things we do is we often say, why don't you get the developers to sign off on the risk and just tell them it's okay that you didn't do it, but when the incident responder comes to us and says, we're trying to clean up a breach and we'd like to know who accessed this bucket, their name's sitting beside the thing that says we didn't turn logging on. It changes the aspect of it a little bit when they have to sign off on it. And it does help when you actually try to make those kind of distributed teams responsible for that security. And I think actually security of the future has to be distributed, right? We've said that a million times, but there's no way a central body can deal with the fact of the scope of how fast some of this cloud stuff is being built out. And we need to make that distributed, which is neat. And then the other thing you talked about, of course, is keys being put in places they're not supposed to, whether it's GitHub or a storage account, blob, as you say, or whatever. Finding that stuff in the wrong places happens all too often in our customers. And again, because developers have a tendency to put it where it's convenient and not necessarily where it should be. So anyway, absolutely, very interesting stuff. Look, I always break the privilege escalation thing into 5 parts. And to understand each one of these 5, they're different, and some of them are really obvious and some of them are not. And in the concept of cloud, it's great to talk about them all. First concept we always talk about is just direct self-escalation. So if your identity, through some combination of groups and assumed roles and whatever you can do, ends up being able to, you know, add permissions to your own identity, then pretty much you can directly escalate your own privilege to whatever you want it to be. And you wouldn't think that would ever happen, but amazingly it does sometimes when you give identities the ability to update policies. If they can update the policy that's attached to them, then they can update their own rights. So that's an interesting, pretty common one that's pretty simple. There's also kind of the concept of indirect escalation, where you actually modify another person or another system or another whatever non-person identity's credentials, and then find a way to impersonate it. And often if you have enough ability to modify, you know, the rights of those other identities, you can modify them in such a way that you can impersonate them, which is another kind of indirect escalation, but results in the same problem, but actually obfuscates who's actually doing it sometimes, which makes it a little more damaging. Then we have this kind of concept, and this is not as prevalent in Amazon as it is in GCP and Azure, but this kind of unintended inheritance. You know, we always talked in enterprise, you know, if you were setting up a SQL server and you wanted, you know, some Active Directory group to have access to that, you configured the SQL server to go and, you know, use that as its identity source, and you created some rules that said these groups can get in here. But in the clouds, what happens is that you stand up that SQL server and you click a box that says, oh, this uses, you know, Azure Active Directory permissions. And then somebody that has, you know, an entitlement at a management group somewhere above that thing may inherit rights directly into that data store. And it was probably not intended to be that way, but it happened just due to the automation and wiring of these clouds. And we see that used a lot when, you know, again, you're trying to do discovery across these accounts. You'll find things that you gained access to that you probably didn't think you had access to. So that's kind of an interesting one that's a little new in this world. Confused deputies, interesting. This is kind of where you can, you know, use a resource or a service with permissions that you can cause that service or thing to do things, and it will do things on your behalf. And as it's doing it, you're acting as that other thing. It's a little bit like impersonation, but you're actually usually getting a service or something to do it for you. There's a lot of privilege escalation examples that use that. Maybe we'll show a few in the demo in a few minutes. And then this kind of last one is fun. Resource permission escalation, something you would never think of. I always say, you know, you've somehow, one of your pen testers has gotten into the account. They've gotten to the point that they can see the data in the S3 bucket, so they can read the data in the S3 bucket, and they're like, man, we could do a ransomware attack here, but they can't modify the data. They haven't gotten to that level of permission. However, the identity that they've gained access to has the ability to change maybe the life cycle of the data, because maybe it was being, you know, put there as log data, and then that was, you know, using something to move the data to Glacier over time or whatever. So they can change the life cycle policy. Well, what's really interesting is if you can read the data, you can suck all the data out, then change the life cycle policy to delete the data after 0 days. All the data goes away. You have the data, and now you can kind of own the thing. And it's one of those worlds where, you know, it's not a sensitive permission, or you don't necessarily think about it as a crazy sensitive permission, but by changing that one resource policy, you can actually do some pretty serious damage. So I kind of walked through those 5. I don't know which ones are the favorites, Serge, from your team and what they do, but you know, what's the most common thing you see?
The last point, the resource permission escalation, that example you gave, that's super interesting. Where I'm just, read access means I can see everything. I can siphon it off, like you said. And then if I can actually change it to, you know, if I can store this for any more than 0 days, that would be a critical type of vulnerability where you want to know if the permission is there to accomplish that. If people aren't paying attention, it's difficult to answer that question. Now, but to directly answer your question, confused deputy, that's probably my favorite one, and where I've seen a lot of success for my team and my personal perspective on that, where it's more of a, first time I saw that was web application pen testing, where you have a cross-site request forgery vulnerability, and now it's, you know, server-side request forgery. And if I can just, you know, find some type of function or find some type of way to, you know, invoke a command and leverage a service that has more permission than I do to get that command to execute for me, all of a sudden, well, I might as well just be admin. as long as I can see kind of the results of that, it makes it a little bit easier for the attack to work. But that's my favorite one. That's where I'm seeing a lot of kind of fallout from poor configuration. But it all centers around the overall and overarching conversation topic, which is identity access management, dealing with these non-people identities and understanding those interactions between your services and between all these different components inside your environment. And that's where it just gets challenging to keep track of all that stuff.
It does. It certainly does. And it, again, we go back to those breaches thing and we say, well, whatever, there's a bunch of misconfigurations and stuff. Today that's low hanging fruit and it's easy for nefarious attackers, but it's not going to last, right? In time, those things, I don't know if you've ever created a public bucket in Amazon, but they send you about 14 emails a day telling you about it if you do it now. So, some of that low hanging fruit goes away. And then these types of attacks start to be used in the wild a lot more. I know you guys as pen testers use them all the time, but we will see that, as the future. Right now, they're still easy targets, but as the targets get harder, they're going to up their game. So look, there's some interesting best practices you can do here to help this. We've talked about them a few times through here, and after this, maybe we'll show a couple of examples in a demo if I can get logged into a system here. Look, you have all of these kind of highly permissioned identities. Sometimes they're break glass roles, they're there for purpose. Sometimes they're admins. Certainly you shouldn't have your admins using admin permissions for their daily work, but it does happen in some organizations. You got to manage those pretty carefully and create them pretty carefully and have them locked down and have the right sets of alerting on them so that when they're used, not just the person that is using them knows about them, but somebody else knows about them as well. So you've got to do some great management of that. I'm a big believer in this distribution of having teams, certify these identities that are being created. It's I have to admit, I struggle sometimes talking to identity governance teams these days because they've come from this enterprise world and they talk mainly about people identities and they say to things like us, this isn't hard. We're just going to take whoever owns the application and have their manager sign off on the identities. And you're like, I don't know who the manager of the Lambda function is, right? It's who is that person, and you find out that, well, the dev team all works for this person and you're asking that person to sign off that they wrote great code to build this kind of infrastructure as code that has a piece of compute tied to an identity that's doing these things. They probably don't have the right context. And so sometimes it needs to be, the security architecture team out of the cloud that needs to sign off on that or something. And so sometimes it's not as direct as a manager anymore when we're talking about these non-people identities. So having that distributed to the right teams is critical. We also have this kind of, avoid this over permissioning, right? And develop kind of a least privilege. We keep talking about least privilege for years and zero trust and all these fancy words. But, and again, if you have an automation role that only needs to do 10 things, why have you given it star permission and allowed it to create, SageMaker notebooks in Amazon, right? It probably doesn't need to create a SageMaker notebook. Why are you allowing it to do that? Because those permissions give things like creating pre-signed URLs, which can allow outside access in and things like that. So again, you got to monitor that stuff. Of course, you want to remove any of the dormant identities. It's another thing we see a lot, Serge, and I'm sure your pen testers love this, is that we walk into an account that's been in cloud for 5 years. They've done, continuous delivery for the last 5 years of certain applications. As the code got better over time, everything got better, but these dormant identities got left around and they're just sitting there, with a whole bunch of permissions attached to them. You see that quite often. And obviously, behavior monitoring, looking for anomalies and all this is key as well. So those are some things we try to help customers with and get them through this. But a lot of this stuff you can do using, even simple tools. Like, if you just want to find unused identities, there are tooling to do that in the open source world. The cloud providers have some tools for it, whichever. We have a tendency to focus on the more advanced cases of, creating least privilege policies. But, there's a lot of tools out there that can help sweep those environments and clean this stuff up. So any other thoughts there?
That's a good point. Yeah, absolutely. So the dormant identities, I think that comes down to two different kind of root causes. From my experience looking at this, I would say there's fear-driven, where you've shifted left over the years. You have your CI/CD pipeline, and what you started with 5 years ago was just like, it works, and I don't want to change it because it looks like it's dormant, but it might not be. And if we remove it, it's going to break functionality. Let's just leave it there. And I've seen that, over the course of my 15, 16, 17 years of experience doing this before cloud was even a thing. That's always been, that little little reminder in the back of people's head, like, hey, this works. If it's not broke, don't fix it. And then, you know, the breach happens next year because you didn't fix it. And the other flip side of that is you don't know. You don't know it doesn't exist. And there's plenty of tools out there that can easily help identify those type of dormant accounts, or, you know, it's based on activity. But if you're not looking for, or you don't know what to look for, or here's what you said, identity governance teams. And I made a note about that. If the company even has an identity governance team, like, something here is maturity. Like, a lot of companies don't have that. They don't have, you know, dedicated teams to look at these things. It could be, especially the smaller shops or even in medium-sized businesses, you know, the whole concept of, you know, security is everyone's responsibility. That's great, but if you don't have, you know, that overarching, I would say, team or overarching culture where that's really impressed upon each individual, it becomes very challenging to make that a reality. It's a talking point, but, you know, having maturity as a company and having, you know, the teams drawn out and dedicated to each one of these various facets, it takes effort, it takes headcount, and it takes money to do this. So having some tools that can help with it would really be awesome.
Yeah. Look, I think why don't we do this? Let's look at some data, because I think it's fun to do this. If I can get logged in here, we will see. I always tell people, if you're ever going to start a company, make the domain name short so you don't have to type it in demos in very long ways. And you know, again, make sure you've got all your MFA tokens and everything done beforehand and the browser memorized so you can get in. And I think we're gonna win today. So I think I'm in. So look, while this thing loads up, one of the things that Sunry does, which is kind of neat, is this thing called effective permission. So we basically take those interesting identity chains that this particular identity can assume this role, and then that role can assume another role. And we use that to kind of do this mapping, again, a word Serge used several times here, of the entire identity structure across multiple accounts, across multiple clouds. And we do kind of interesting things with it in terms of trying to find, you know, privilege escalation examples is one of the core functionality here. So we've got, you don't really need to understand this for today, but if you ever had interest, we could spend some time on it. But basically, these are different applications. So you've got a credit app development environment, a staging environment, a credit production environment. There's a payment app down here, and then across the bottom are different kind of, you know, findings and detections that are happening. And there's a whole set of privilege escalation examples here. So we'll take kind of this look at this production environment here for this. Because we're talking about non-people identities today, we'll use non-people things. So, you know, you might have this kind of scenario of this dev deploy function that has the ability to self-escalate its rights through data pipelines, just a service in Amazon. What's interesting about it is you notice that we clicked on credit app production here, but this resource is in development, which seems kind of weird. So you may want to understand, well, how does something in development privilege escalate into production? So you see you've got your Lambda function here. And this is kind of a crafty little privilege escalation where it's a combination of creating a pipeline, so you get to create some code. You get a definition of that pipeline, and you use the definition to basically cause the code to execute. So now you're executing your code, and you use pass role, and pass role allows you to pass a different role to it. So if it has more rights than you, now you have escalated your rights. And so it's a pretty simple little combination, but it's kind of neat. What's interesting about this is when we look at the path of how this happens, you can start with this kind of, you know, lowly function, which has the ability, maybe with a very strong policy, that it can only assume this one other role. And that given role may also have a policy that says it can assume this particular role. And so it jumps through a couple of roles, or it can jump through. It doesn't, not saying it did it, but it gets into this kind of local deploy role, and then that role gets into this code deploy role. What's interesting about this is that this then allows this kind of jump from the development environment into the production environment. And so what happens is there may be, you know, multiple different roles in production that trust this role. And because of that, theoretically, this lowly Lambda function, if you could manipulate what it's doing, you could get into all three of these roles. And once you're into all three of them, each one of them has, you know, one of those three permissions and allows you to basically escalate your rights. And so it's kind of an interesting scenario where you can basically, you know, model out these kind of effective permissions and then ask questions like, oh, if I had the ability to assume a role and I had the ability to update the role's policy, then I could escalate that role's permissions that I have access to assume. So you can ask the system questions like that to find those kind of, I always call them toxic combinations of permissions, which allow that kind of escalation. And that's a fairly complex example. There's no one policy you could look at in Amazon Anywheres that would allow you to find that. You only find it through trying many things and understanding that. But some of them are not so complicated, right? If we were to go into, and we'll use an Azure example this time, we go into something like an Azure example, you can see this kind of demo 4 scenario. This is a scenario where, you have a service principal tied to some sort of an application, but the permissions that it's been given, allow it to do things like, if I could find the permission here, do policy assignments and definitions. And so if you can do that, now you can manipulate what those policies and assignments are. And so now, of course, it can do something that looks a lot more like an indirect escalation, because it can modify policies on resources it can get to. So again, lots of combinations of this stuff, Serge, that we find in customers every day. Some of it is, known, and you have that example of the, oh, yeah, we knew we configured the build role to do that. It's okay. It's like, well, I'm not sure if it's okay or not, but you definitely do it. And then some of it's very unintentional, right? No one had the idea that that role would be able to unlock that combination through 3 or 4 different things it could get to. I always think, pen testers kind of like this tool because it kind of gives them a map. It's like, oh, I can map the whole thing and I know where all the soft spots are to go and do this. But it's a great way to look at that type of stuff. I'm sure you guys use a lot of open source tools, don't you, Serge, when you're kind of doing a lot of this stuff and teaching SANS courses? Bloodhound, which is kind of, I've used that before, which is kind of neat. So
yeah, I'm wondering, since I haven't seen this, I was wondering if first thing that went through my mind is like, is there a command line version of this where I can just run this and get a quick report? Maybe you can map it out and escalate privilege for me, automate the whole process.
There definitely, we can talk about that later after this, but yeah, there's a whole API interface to this. It uses GraphQL, so you basically make GraphQL calls to it, and it dumps JSON back that you can basically see all of these soft spots, and then you can poke at them. But so we find all this stuff. A lot of the work that we do with customers, though, is actually back to the first part that you were talking about in terms of like, monitoring and governing and making sure that somebody knows about this stuff and signs off on it. So another thing that we do a lot of is, we divide up all of the customers' cloud into their different teams. We assign the responsibilities of those teams to those apps. And then we kind of figure out who's supposed to sign off on risk. And so, you may end up with a scenario where you end up with a credit app production environment and you get, some identity that has, full administrative or IAM rights to these given accounts. Maybe it's a bot as an example. And so we'll actually, say, somebody's got to go off and certify this. They have to make a risk exception for why this bot truly needs, IAM star permissions, right? Oh, maybe it's a bot for doing just-in-time provisioning. Okay, it probably makes sense that it has that. But if it's a bot for deleting, public S3 buckets, it really doesn't need IAM permissions to do that, right? And so you would sign off on that, and somebody would do that. And then, of course, we talked a lot about, just giving stuff, permissions that it needs. And that's another scenario where we see a lot of this work where we'll map out, all of the different, trust relationships and things and say, are these trust relationships even in use? And you find out that, you open a trust relationship up to an entire account. I don't know how much you know about the Amazon model, but when it's colon-root, it means it trusts everything in the account basically that has permission to do it. But, you can monitor the actual logs and find out that the only thing that ever does it is this clone deploy dev role. Well, if that's the only thing that does it, why are you trusting the whole account? Why not lock it down to just that principle, right? So we spend a lot of time with customers really trying to, help them get to kind of least privilege within these applications. And some of the customers really embrace it and they'll actually take this stuff and they'll lock everything down. And then some of them kind of go halfway. They're like, look, we got to take some of these rights away, but we still have to, let our developers innovate and things. And so they put a lot of more anomaly detection and monitoring on it to find out, did some identity do something today it's never done before and things like that. So it kind of works both ways. But again, just some interesting examples. I thought it would be kind of fun to show that stuff in the middle of these slides, just on that side. Look, I'll give you the 2-minute pitch on summary security, and then Serge, I'll let you wrap up, and then we'll hand it back to Carol. But this identity in cloud is so important. As we said over and over, it is one of the primary controls you're going to use for defense in depth. It's how the cloud vendors themselves control their clouds. And so it's important that you understand what's going on there from an identity perspective, and you have tooling to help you get the least privilege. We didn't talk about it today. Data is another key part of this. You know, Serge brought up several times that, you know, these access keys get left in places they're not supposed to. You need ways to find those, lock them down, and make sure they're not sitting in somebody's Cloud Shell account that, you know, anyone with access to that kind of subscription or whatever it is can get access to them, and then all of a sudden impersonate those users. So data is important as well. You also should know where your data is that's important and what the controls are around it. And then this kind of whole, you know, people call it CSPM, right? Is the cloud configured properly in the first place? Do you have public buckets? Do you have internet exposed machines? Do you have vulnerabilities on machines that have administrative permissions? All of those types of things. So the platform governance is also important in getting it to the right people. So that's what we do at Sunry. Again, I think if anyone is interested, we would love to hear from you. You know, you can go to sunrysecurity.com and just sort of sign up for a consultation or a risk assessment, or even just chat with us. And there's always lots of people there to answer your questions on that side. Serge, any comments from you before we hand it back to Carol and let the audience ask some questions?
Yeah, I think my final takeaway from a 10,000 foot level here would be, and we mentioned kind of the terminology once or twice already, and that the whole concept of defense in depth. And to do a really good job at securing a cloud infrastructure and your company and its presence inside of the cloud, it takes a lot of work to do. And I think that it's going to be useful for, and maybe this goes without saying, but I think it's going to be really useful for a company to focus on various elements of that security posture and delve into it as deeply as it possibly can, one area at a time. And whether that's IAM focused solutions, non-people identity issues like we've talked about for like the last 50 or so minutes here, just get in there, do something really well, implement the tool to 100%, and then move on to the next thing you have to do. We mentioned monitoring a lot as well, and other things like that. But there's just so much to keep track of and so many different areas to screw up. It's important to have a quality tool and quality people, you know, to help really do the best of your ability to lock down the environment, because there's so many complexities to deal with here. So take that for what it's worth, I'd say.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Again, working with so many customers over the last 3 or 4 years, you just have this scenario where somebody believes they can take whatever, we have 500 AWS accounts. We're going to try to secure the whole 5. You can't believe how many Serge come to us and say, turn the NIST framework on for all 500 of our accounts. We're like, you really shouldn't do that. You end up with like 10,000 tickets the next day. You've got to start, where's the production data? Where's the sensitive data? Let's figure out what that looks like first before we get to this thing. But people want to do it. They want to see how bad it is, right? But I find it, security people are good at okay, we got to prioritize, we got to stack rank, we got to do that stuff. I find with the developers, sometimes it becomes a bit overwhelming when you show them 10,000 problems. So you've got to focus it, right, as you say, and then do it really well. If you have sensitive data in this environment, let's lock that down solid and know that that's good before we move on to the next one. And no, it's a good process for sure.
Absolutely.
So Carol, I think we're going to hand it back to you, see if there's any questions from the audience, and we'll answer those. Serge and I will do our best to answer them, and then wrap up for the day.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, and if you could pull up the slide full screen, that'd be great.
Oh, sorry. I could have done that. Yes.
Yeah, no worries, it's all good. All right, so yes, we do have quite a few questions ready for the Q&A. However, if anyone has a question for our presenters, please enter it into the questions window now. Our first one asks, can you create custom policies? And if so, how do those work with the existing policies?
Interesting. That's so it's kind of interesting when you work with a lot of customers. Some customers will want to build custom policies, so they will have very specific ways that they may want to move data in and out of their cloud, or they'll have very specific controls on identity. No developer will ever create an internet gateway. And so with Sunry Security, you can always build custom policies. You can link them into a specific, what we call swim lane, so one of those environments. You can say this policy applies to this environment, or all environments if you want it to be all, and then do this kind of custom direction of these findings back to the teams or the the identity is responsible for that. So certainly can create custom policies. One of the things that's kind of interesting in cloud is it's hard to know exactly what the custom policy you want to create is. So one of the things we started doing quite a while ago is we not only collect the kind of data that we know we need for our policies, but we have a tendency, as we call the cloud APIs and look at the cloud audit data, to pull in the raw JSONs and payload for those, so you can actually map kind of, you know, whatever you want against that as well. So lots of custom policies. So.
All right, thank you. The next one asks, you use the term effective permissions. Can you dive into what that means?
So maybe one more, Serge, maybe you comment too. You know, when we talk about effective permissions, we always talk about, you know, if you take any given identity, people, non-people, system, whatever it is, that identity has its own permissions. So maybe it has the ability to assume a role or access a key or whatever it is. But those permissions that it has often lead to another set of permissions. So if you can assume a role, you inherit its permissions. If you can access a key, that key opens up access to a resource, you now have access to the resource. And so for us, the effective permission chain is basically gathering up all of those things that you can do across all of those assignments and trust and, you know, chaining of identities to give you one set of all of the things that you can do. We also use it to take away permissions. So you may have permission to do something, you know, read a certain bucket, but there's a resource statement on it that says you can only read buckets of a certain type. Well, then you can't read the other buckets, right? So we use it as a way to create a unified set of permissions that an identity can have. I don't know, Serge, any other kind of comments on your side in terms of other thoughts around when people are thinking about the effective permissions of an entity, what else would be important to think about?
Right. So that was a perfect explanation and definition of what effective permissions are. I think and it may be kind of passe to say it, but, you know, principle of least privilege here. And you know, based on this conversation, I think it's really clear that you don't want to have access permission if you don't need to. And a lot of us security professionals already know that. So I'm not saying anything new here. But it's one thing to say it, one thing to do it, and one thing to have confidence that you have restricted access to the absolute least amount of privilege required to do the job. And, you know, saying something and doing something are two different things. So what I've seen in my experience is, yeah, you try your best to limit the effective permissions of a given, you know, whatever happens to be. And then from there, you have to take the next step to ascertain whether or not this is actually putting yourself in a position where the tool or the process or whatever happens to be in the situation is still working properly, or whether you've kind of just broken the process. And so once again, going back to a solution where you can map out those effective permissions are going to be, so you can effectively answer that question and have confidence that your implementation is working, number one, and restricted, number two, is going to be the place you want to try to get to.
Yep.
All right, thank you both. The next one asks, it says, seems Sonri would be a great IAM solution for the cloud. Does it integrate with any data mapping products?
Interesting. So this kind of, I'll answer this in two ways. So, and we didn't talk a lot about the other parts of Sonri today. So Sonri has its own kind of, you know, data discovery, data classification, and the data classification, we kind of do two sides of it, looking for PII, but also looking for access keys and secrets and stuff that are not supposed to be there. So obviously we have a lot of that data mapping functionality built in the product. But that said, customers will often have their own kind of solutions for data classification. You know, they may be using a cloud provider tool, they may be using, you know, Titus, they may be using, you know, there's lots of these kind of solutions out there that do data classification and data tagging. And so one of the things we always did with Sonri was make sure we had integrations where you could enrich the data that Sonri had with other things that you know. And so if you know things like that coming from another data mapping solution, we can pull that in and use that to drive a lot of the policy inside of Sonri. So both parts of it, again, if people are interested in the data side, would certainly love to talk to them and explore that. And then if you have other solutions that you're using and want to bring that into the context, you know, have the findings of it distributed to the teams and have risk acceptances on it, we can do that as well. So yeah, thanks, Carl. It's a good one.
Something else I noticed with integrations, it's not specific to the question, but it does speak to integrations. I saw you had a lot of integrations with you know, anything from Kubernetes to Splunk and Tenable and ServiceNow. That's actually, I was thinking about that throughout this conversation. I'm thinking, you know, single pane of glass, make it easy for security engineers to be able to look into these issues and do something with it, create tickets and close those tickets and so on and so forth. So that might also be of value to some of the attendees here.
It is, and it's interesting. Actually, the integrations are like such an important part of this whole thing, because so part of it is if you're going to do distributed models where you're actually going to send some of these tickets to the teams, well, no developer wants to log into Sunry. Honestly, they have too many consoles already, right? So you need to be able to integrate with however those teams get their tickets today. And if it's a Jira ticket, then fine, put it in Jira. If it's a ServiceNow ticket, it's ServiceNow. If it's send them a Slack notification because they love Slack, then put it there. So you have those integrations for the people in the workflow and the tickets, but then you have, again, we spent a lot of time today talking about risks, right? This identity is misconfigured or this. But what happens when something bad happens? Somebody disables all of your logging. Well, that ticket needs to go to the SOC, right? So you talk about integrations with Splunk or QRadar or something like that. Those integrations are just as important because there's a set of rules that are threat related, right? And those ones need to go through a different path than a risk because somebody misconfigured something. Again, integration seems to be our life. It's, some is in, some is out, but we do a lot of integration work all the time. So thanks, Serge.
All right, thanks. The next one asks, it says, the definition of non-people identities is really broad and includes a lot to compute. I feel like following this will just bury us in tickets. How do you get around
that? That's back to our NIST comment. Let's turn NIST on across the whole cloud and get 10,000 tickets. You have to focus, Carol, again, and I think, again, Serge said this so well, right? Focus on one area, doing one thing and nail it, get it good, and trust it, and then move to the next one. And there's, again, we work with so many customers at different levels of maturity, right? I have one customer that has, all of their teams onboarded, and for those teams, they have a set of rules that they direct back to those teams, but they know they haven't completely nailed yet getting to the next level. So the things that those people are fixing are the public buckets, the machines exposed to the internet, poor security group configurations and things like that. They know there's another set that they're looking at, that as soon as the first set's done, they're going to move immediately to that, but they're going to nail the first part first and get it right. And it seems nice if vendors come in and tell you, look, you can just turn the thing on and magically all your problems go away, but that's not right. It does take work to basically, clean up the mess you've created for the last 5 years, and you got to start in one spot and focus. And again, Serge, I'm sure you work with customers every day yourself, because I'm sure your pen testers go in and find a whole bunch of problems. You've got to direct them to the, here's where to start, right? And I think you guys probably help them with that too from time to time.
Absolutely. And from this, directly answering the question, in my thought process, I was thinking development environment. You don't have to, turn everything on in prod. Let's roll this out. Let's demo it. Let's put it in a non-prod environment. Let's see what it looks like, and whittle it down from there. And that's true of any tool that you're going to deal with. You have to make sure you're tuning it and putting in the time to understand how it works, its quirks, using the API, like you said, leveraging those integrations, so you're not inundated with a bunch of things that may not be relevant to you at that moment in time. And then from there, you always work towards the implementing to 100%. So it's humming along as smoothly as it possibly can inside that environment. But yeah, you don't need to push to prod, go to non-prod, make sure you're understanding how it works, and then, like I said, kind of tune it to your environment to get the most out of it.
Yeah.
All right, thanks. How do you govern proliferation of custom roles?
Custom roles are and again, you're probably talking about Azure in this case if you're talking about custom roles, whoever it is, because generally speaking, that's the term that's used in Azure when you start to stop using the built-in Azure roles and you're using, custom ones for fit for purpose, which is a great practice, by the way, and highly recommend it. The other clouds have similar terminology. They're called different things, but it doesn't, again, from that perspective. We actually are big believers in custom roles and custom policies, because again, in order to get to least privilege, the out of the box rules generally won't fit every use case. They're good for some, right, but they're not good for everything. And so if you're building custom applications, you're generally going to have custom roles for them if you want them to be even close to a least privilege or a less privileged state. So the trick is actually to govern those like you do all of the roles. And if you can understand what permissions and entitlements are inside of that, assignment, then you can govern it. And there's not really any difference between it being a built-in role or a custom role, as long as you understand the permissions underneath of it. And so again, as long as whatever tooling you're using understands the permissions of those custom roles, there's really nothing different between using those and there is using the out-of-the-box roles that come from the provider. You still have to get somebody to sign off on the fact that that Lambda function has the ability to do X, Y, and Z, whatever that is, regardless if it's assigned through some custom policy, an inline policy, a resource policy, or a custom role. Again, the governance is the same. I think the trap that some people fell into with Azure was they wrote a whole bunch of tooling looking for things like owner and contributor and reader and storage account key operator and these things. And when Azure kind of released to the wild this ability to do custom roles that you didn't have to have I think it was an E5 subscription for, and all of a sudden everybody could create them, a lot of the kind of off-the-shelf tooling stopped working, right? And so you needed to make sure you were understanding what was written in the policy instead of just the out-of-the-box ones. So it worked until people could change them. So when they weren't changeable, you didn't have to worry about that. But then, again, we've gotten to this next stage where basically everybody can create custom roles now in Azure. So I'm assuming that's what that question is directed at. So.
All right, thank you. The next one asks, in AWS, what's your take on attribute-based policies?
This is, again, another one that's kind of interesting. Serge, I don't know if you've looked into this too much. So in the AWS model, they keep adding more and more functionality to it. And over the last couple of years, they've added more and more attribute-based policies, which means you can give somebody permissions to something like whatever, read buckets, but then you can put conditions on it but only when the tag says non-production, right? And then so if you go into an environment and a bucket is tagged as non-production, you'd be able to read it. And so it gives a lot of extension into the kind of RBAC model and the role-based models in these cloud providers. My fear is, and I would love to hear Serge's opinion on this from the pen tester perspective, I suspect most of the people that red team accounts love it, because the reality is if they can figure out how to manipulate the attribute on the resource they may have gained access to, they may be able to manipulate an identity that's been locked down to then access that resource. Again, it's one of those things where if done right, it's amazingly powerful, especially for automation and kind of at scale stuff. But I also worry that I think the pen testers probably kind of love the fact that, if I can get the ability to change the tag, then I can get the ability to access the resource. So I don't know, Serge, have your guys spent much time in that?
Yeah, we have. There's an if, and if we can do that, then it's very powerful. It's not always easy to do. That's the hard part, is actually changing those. So there's a conditional statement, it's all in JSON, and you can clearly see what you're allowed to do within the context of that role and that permission for that various resource. Changing that typically is going to require you have the ability to modify, and that's kind of where we go back to mapping what permissions you currently have and how you could potentially escalate that privilege. And while it is possible, it's difficult to do in more mature environments where they've looked at that as a threat, they've modeled that threat, and they've locked it down properly. Of course, when those issues do arise, it always comes down to it's a misconfiguration, and the misconfiguration allowed us to do this in a very quickly, easily type of format, if you will. So it's an if. If it's misconfigured, then it's no problem. But if it's set up properly, then it's not really an easy way to gain access from that perspective.
And it's probably a scenario, like if I think about Amazon, right, it's like you're going to do it or you're not going to do it, right? So if you're going to do it and you're going to say, okay, well, tags now become part of the identity model, then the ability to add a tag or modify a tag becomes a highly privileged function in the cloud. It's as as permissioned as being able to change an IAM policy, right? Whereas generally you wouldn't think of it that way. So I think that's the other thing, is if you're starting to use those types of scenarios, you've got to kind of embrace it and say, okay, well, now anything that can change that attribute is making it just as sensitive as everything else. So.
All right, thanks. We'll squeeze this last one in. If an organization is not in the cloud and has robust layered controls to protect from outside attacks, should similar levels of control be used to protect internal resources on the network?
You know, when we started Sunrise Security, I was able to jump all feet into the cloud, and I like it here. I'm very happy and comfortable here. A lot of the things that we talk about today all do translate into on-premise as well. On-prem, obviously, it's sometimes harder to find things. You know, there's stuff hidden in places that you can't get access to. One of the great things about cloud is there's an API to everything, so you can find everything. You kind of have a runtime CMDB of everything that's there. But the same principles apply to everything on-prem as well. So there's no different in the principles that we talked about today. Some of them are harder to achieve on-prem than they are in cloud. So.
Absolutely, that's just by nature of design. That what do you call it? The CMDB. What did you say? Runtime CMDB via the API. That's
real time.
Yeah,
it is.
That's real. That's real. That's a great way to look at it. But we don't have that on-prem. On-prem, you have something called a CMDB, and you have to manually update it, or usually sometimes. But yeah, everything we're talking about here definitely translates to on-prem. It's just not as easy to do because you don't have access to everything all the time.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Sandy and Serge, for your great presentation, and to Sonri Security for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.